Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Taylor Scott, and I direct the team who is responsible for providing legislators with an independent, agenda-neutral research service, and connecting you all with researchers studying things related to current policy goals. In this work, we have identified legislators across the aisle who are eager to support children and families by offering school choice programs, as well as identifying ways to strengthen their equal access to high quality educational programs. Recognizing that this issue is high on the agenda for many legislators, we've organized a panel today to discuss research related to school choice programs. I want to get us started by introducing our panelists, including our moderator, Lorraine Blatt. She is a doctoral student at the University of Pittsburgh, studying how structural inequities in educational policy influence children's development. This includes a line of research looking at associations between district-level school choice enrollment and district-wide test score gaps. Also with us today is Dr. Kevin Wellner, who is a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder School of Education. He specializes in policy and law, received his JD and PhD, and is a co-founder of the National Education Policy Center. And among other publications, he's written the book titled School Choice: How Charter Schools Control Access and Shape Enrollment. So with us is Dr. Erica Frankenberg, who is a professor of education and demography in the College of Education at Penn State. She received her doctorate of education from Harvard University and directs the Center for Education and Civil Rights. She studies inequality in K-12 schools, including racial segregation and metropolitan policies. Before we get started, I have a couple of notes on housekeeping. Please note that the Research Policy Collaboration is a nonpartisan and independent entity. We emphasize the use of empirical evidence in policymaking, and as such, we will not discuss political questions or questions that are irrelevant to the focus of this panel. We also encourage respectful audience participation through the Q&A feature of this event. You can use a thumbs up on existing questions under the Q&A menu. We'll prioritize questions that are particularly popular. We can also try to answer those questions as we go. We'll also make some time throughout to answer some questions, as well as particularly maybe some discussion at the end. So I've enabled captions during today's event using the live transcript feature. If you have any problems with anything, please message me and to let me know. So now I'd like to hand it off to Lorraine, who's going to get us started. Thank you so much, Lorraine.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very excited for this conversation. So today we're going to be talking about research on school choice. And when we say school choice today, that's particularly going to mean magnet schools, charter schools, and voucher programs. So there's so much variability in these different programs that we're going to focus on in our discussion today. But just to get us started on kind of a shared general understanding, I'm going to give kind of a very big picture overview of just what these different forms of school choice are. So students typically participate in school choice either through a lottery or test-based admissions or some other means that, again, varies drastically, which we'll get into. So starting with magnets, over 2.5 million students currently attend magnet schools. So that's over 5% of all public school students in the US. And magnet schools typically offer some kind of thematic curriculum. So whether that's STEM or arts or languages. And as the name suggests, magnets typically draw students from multiple neighborhoods or school districts. And were actually originally founded in the 1960s to help districts comply with federal desegregation mandates by offering an opportunity for voluntary integration. But now 70 years later, there's 80 years later, there's a lot more variability in kind of the purpose of magnet schools. But one kind of important piece of magnet schools is that they're governed by the same school district as traditional or neighborhood public schools. And this is one of the big differences between magnets and charters. So charters are also public schools, but they are managed by their own governing body outside of kind of a local school board that manages a school district's neighborhood and traditional public schools. So charter schools were actually founded more recently in the 1990s. The first charter legislation was in Minnesota in 1991. And currently over 3.4 million students attend charters. So that's about 7% of all public school students. And this number is expanding every year or increasing every year. And the missions of charter schools range dramatically. They range from serving as lab schools to test novel pedagogy with specific discipline strategies or a college prep focus. There's also an idea that charters offer an opportunity to test market principles in public education. So yeah, there's a lot of different state variability in charter legislation. But I would say vouchers probably have the most variability of all of the different forms of school choice that we'll discuss. And voucher programs, simply, to put it simply, provide a voucher for families to choose where to send their child to school, often a private school, and they get a financial voucher to contribute to that. And currently 16 states have some kind of voucher program serving over 300,000 students, but there are also similar programs that are sometimes subsumed under vouchers. So there are tuition tax credits, which exist in 22 states, and then there are education savings accounts, which exist in 8 states and currently serve only tens of thousands of students, but there was just a recent universal expansion in Arizona, so that number is also about to increase dramatically. So since school choice is increasing and expanding in the US, it becomes more and more important to talk about kind of what we're seeing across states with school choice, which is why we're here today, to talk about some of this research. And as many of you joining us today, since this is the work you do, you probably know that school choice can be a very polarizing topic for your constituents, your colleagues, for researchers. And when asked questions about the efficacy and implications of charters, magnets, and vouchers, the answer is often, it depends. So today we're going to talk about what some of those things that what are some of the things that it depends on. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Erica Frankenberg and Dr. Kevin Wellner to share some insight on these questions. So to get us started, since my overview was kind of very big picture and very general, I would just love to talk about some of the variability in these different programs and maybe some current policy issues affecting these different programs. So to get us started, maybe Dr. Frankenberg, you can talk about magnets and charters, and then maybe Dr. Wellner, you can expand on charters and talk about vouchers.
Great, Lorraine, thanks for that helpful context setting. As Lorraine mentioned, magnet schools began as a part of desegregation. They are not exclusively that today, but many of them sort of originated from that, and in part are continued because school districts have had really popular experiences. Some of these schools are the most sought after, particularly in urban districts that maybe have had declining populations. One difference between states and sometimes even within states is some magnet schools, particularly incentivized by recent federal legislation, have started moving towards interdistrict magnet schools. And so what this means is a magnet school may actually accept applicants from multiple different school districts, which also helps to address some of the concerns of variability between school districts. And so we see that, for example, there have been some in the San Antonio, Texas area. One of the largest examples to date is the Hartford, Connecticut interdistrict magnet system that has, over 24 magnet schools that draws from the surrounding, I think, like 40 different districts. So this varies again across states. Not all states have magnet schools. Typically, we see them in some of the northeastern states, although maybe that's not even a fair generalization. I've seen them in a number of southern states as well. Lorraine and I are actually both graduates of magnet schools ourselves. I went to one in Southern Alabama. So they often don't have admissions requirements, but some, like a performing arts, may have like an audition or something like that. Again, these differences matter for whose schools enroll, and we can get to that later. In comparison, charter schools are often, though not always, actually separate from a district. So actually there's some states in which the district charters its own, has charter schools within the district, which is just a little bit of a different kind of design. So there are approximately 40 to 45 states that have state charter school laws. And really, when I teach about this, for example, I say that we don't just have one sort of idea that are charter schools. We have like 40 plus different iterations of what charter schools are. So, some states, for example, only allow charter schools to be chartered in certain districts, typically urban districts, for example. Some permit transfer across school district attendance zone boundaries. So, or school district boundaries rather. So Pennsylvania, for example, you can even get school busing up to 10 miles beyond the district that you live in. Some have virtual schools. And so when we say charter in terms of who can charter them, what relationship charters have to the school district they live in differs, whether they're virtual or brick and mortar varies, the funding stream, reimbursement for special education, all of these vary quite differently between the different states. And some of the research shows that this matters in terms of what students enroll, what kind of experiences they have, and how it affects the traditional public schools, which are all important policy questions. So Kevin, maybe I'll let you expand from there.
Yeah, well, I think I'll just jump into the voucher issue, which hasn't been addressed yet. Well, to some extent, Lorraine's description, I'll build on that. So there are three major different types of what fall under that larger voucher umbrella. There are conventional vouchers, which is, you think about providing funding through the state general fund. So you raise revenue, it comes into the state general fund, and then the money is allocated through conventional vouchers. A parent makes a decision about which participating private school they want their child to attend. The state provides the voucher for the parent to sign over to the school. The school then cashes in the money to fund the tuition. That's the conventional mechanism, and that's what existed for a long time as the only thing we meant by vouchers. There were old-fashioned tax credits available to parents who were sending their kids to private schools to offset some of the cost, but that was about it. Then Arizona again came up with a new approach, using tax credits, not in that old-fashioned way, but by encouraging people who owe money to the state or corporations that owe money to the state to, instead of paying that tax money that they owe to the state, donating money to a school tuition organization, which is essentially a nonprofit that exists for the specific purpose. So all the different people who are incentivized to do this provide their money to one or more of these school tuition organizations. In Florida, there's basically just one. In Arizona, there are hundreds, if not thousands of these things, probably hundreds. And so the school tuition organization then bundles that donated money and gives it out in what looks very much like the old-fashioned conventional voucher to parents who apply. School tuition organizations tend to be focused on a particular set of schools. So for example, in Arizona, there's the Archdiocese of Tucson and the Archdiocese of Phoenix. So they're the two biggest school tuition organizations set up to serve those schools. And then what happens is if I'm the person giving the money to donate, once I've given that money, I then offset that amount, and I don't pay that money to the state. So I get, in Arizona, 100% tax credit. So that's a workaround. It's a more complicated system. It has, for the advocates of that approach, it has some legal benefits, and it also has some policy benefits that are perceived around it being less regulated than the conventional system. And then most recently, and again, Arizona leading the way, we have education savings accounts or empowerment scholarship accounts. They all go by the acronym ESA, but sometimes there are different words under the E and the S. And those policies are the most deregulated. And it essentially just says to a parent, if you don't send your child to public school, we will instead provide you with, depends on the state again, but we'll provide you with most of the money that we would otherwise have provided to the school. You then essentially get a debit card under the ESA program. You can get a bank account, savings account with a debit card that the state puts money into, and you can use that money for educational purposes. It could be used by homeschoolers for various purposes. And it can be used to pay for tuition. It can be used for a variety of things. And depending on which state, again, there can be some sort of oversight to make sure that money is spent, or it could be largely just sort of, let's hope the parent spends it properly on the child. There also is the potential for that money not spent to then be carried over and used for higher education in the ESA. So those are the three basic approaches that we have to voucher programs.
Thank you so much. Yeah, as you all can see, it can get very complicated very quickly the more you get into the weeds. So to talk about research a bit, so when we look at school choice research, there are so many different studies, and some show that some are comparing students in charters to the students in traditional public schools. Some are looking at the district achievement overall. Some are looking at non-academic outcomes. But one thing that tends to be true is, again, there's the theme of variability. There's so much variability in these different outcomes. So sometimes we see that school choice has benefits to the students who attend. Sometimes we see that students perform worse when they are part of a school choice or enrolled in some kind of school choice. And sometimes we see no effect at all. So I would love to hear from both of you, based on your own research and research you've read, what gives rise to the variability in all of these different outcomes?
Erica, do you want to take a first stab at that, or should I? I'll take that as you're muted, but I'll run with it. Children, like all of us, learn when they have opportunities to learn. And a child sitting in a classroom getting those opportunities to learn isn't looking outside the door to see whether it says, you know, Euclid Charter School or Euclid Elementary School or Euclid Private School. And so the differences in terms of student outcomes, to the extent that those outcomes are being validly measured, which is a separate question, the differences that we see are largely about the opportunities and resources provided within a given school. So we all know within the traditional public school systems, there is pretty great variability in terms of students' opportunities to learn within those schools. The same is true within, when we measure the differences within the Catholic school sector. The mean is very similar to public schools, but you also have that distribution. Same thing within the charter school sector. The mean is very similar to the mean being the arithmetic average. It's very similar to the Catholic school sector and the traditional public school sector. The charter school sector also looks very similar. So the differences that we see oftentimes are in the distribution, like whether you have this sort of the traditional bell-shaped curve or whether it's a little more skewed or jagged. But the means tend to be very similar in all three of those. There are two things I should point out here. One is that vouchers and charter schools are deregulatory reforms. And the deregulations, I'll focus on the charter schools in particular. The idea with charter schools is that we are freeing up essentially entrepreneurs, creative people who are going to come in and do innovative things that the bureaucratic structure in the traditional public school sector wouldn't do or can't do. That's the goal. That's the model. When you deregulate, you do free up people to do creative things, and then you also free up people to do things that are not particularly desired, right? So it's the idea with any deregulation, you are creating a wider spread in a lot of ways. And so we see some particularly creative things in the charter school sector and some particularly horrific things in the charter school sector. And that's just the nature of deregulation. With the results that we see in the voucher world are particularly interesting right now because there are like two things. I'm sorry, this is going to be a little bit long-winded, but I think it's an important thing to point out. Most of the voucher policies that particularly the ones that move beyond the conventional voucher mechanism I described, most of those policies do not require, the laws don't have strong accountability and transparency elements. And so we don't know a lot about what's happening within those sectors in terms of student outcomes. We also don't know a lot in terms of the fiscal impacts for a lot of the same reasons. But there have been 4 jurisdictions. So let's see if I can get these off the top of my head. Washington, D.C., Indiana, Ohio, and Louisiana, where there are requirements for reporting on student test scores, and there have been high quality studies that have been conducted. And these have all come out within the last decade, and they have all been just devastating in terms of the awful results, particularly for students on math outcomes. So a student who receives a voucher in those programs, what we're tending to see are, I shouldn't say all, I think in one of them, maybe it's DC, the negative effects, I'm trying to remember which state, but the negative effects in one of them started to dissipate. In other words, the students are not doing as bad as in the others. But what we're seeing overall in those studies is that the math outcomes for students who receive vouchers are so awful that they're essentially comparable to or worse than what we're seeing with the pandemic learning loss. It's that bad. And so we need to know more about what's going on in voucher programs, and the laws right now don't allow us to know more. We have these real red flags in a small subset of the programs, but we don't know why those math outcomes are so bad, and we don't know if it would be consistent across the other programs. But one thing that policymakers and lawmakers can do is to make sure that we have the ability to look into that black box and see what's going on. Yeah, so let me stop there.
I wanted to chime in really quickly because I've been thinking about how, one of the risks of innovation is failure. And from an entrepreneurial standpoint, one of the challenges is having good data to know when you need a course correction. And I know that I mentioned that in some of our planning is how do we use good data here? And how do you know what's actually happening? And I think that's kind of what you're prompting on as well, Kevin, is thinking about, well, how do we, have some measures of success so that we can know and have some accountability of how those funds are being used. Sorry, Erica, I didn't want to steal your thunder. I just wanted to kind of create some connecting dots of things.
Well, and just to sort of close the loop on those 2 points, you can see that good data to be able to measure this is sometimes in conflict with deregulation. If you're giving them vouchers to go to non-public schools, then those schools in part may be private because they're not part of the public accountability system. But if they're getting public dollars, then so I think one of the things that we have here, to get back to Lorraine's sort of guiding question, is this challenge of methodology for sure. And I think the second is a challenge of implementation. So if the premise of school choice is to provide parents different kinds of opportunities to find schools that better meet their preferences, then to the extent that they find a school and they stay in it, that can be seen as a success. But there are also other goals that we have for schools as well, and so maybe achievement or critical thinking or all of these other outcomes that we value in terms of public schools. And so that's why then thinking about how do we measure these other outcomes matters a lot. One of the sort of takeaways I think of from the school choice literature, and I'm primarily thinking about charter schools and magnet schools, is the ways in which these details are implemented really matters in terms of what students are accessing it, and then what kind of experiences they're having, and are they staying in the schools? Because of course, the other challenge of course correction is that, for example, if you see that a charter school is not succeeding in terms of educating students or things like that, or not providing opportunities, then there has been some question, should those charter schools then be closed or the charter revoked? Which then means that children are now transferring once again back to a traditional public school, which may be for the best given the kinds of outcomes or experiences that they were having. But those transfers also too can in themselves be disruptive. And so we're just juggling a lot of different, sometimes competing values. I would just also want to pull in from magnet schools. One of the findings has looked traditionally at some of the non-academic outcomes of schools. And this, of course, is not measured equally or the same across different contexts, but one study from the Hartford Interdistrict Magnet School program that I told you about earlier is that students in magnet schools who had more intergroup exposure, so realizing that some were in magnet schools, but they were just really in magnet in name only, right? They were still highly segregated, similar to the traditional public schools. But those who had more integrated experiences had higher sort of intergroup outcomes. So they were more likely to feel connected, have friends across racial lines. Some of the really important benefits of intergroup exposure that can help prepare those students for living and working in a multiracial democracy. And so I like that kind of research because it doesn't just assume that a magnet school is the particular treatment, but looks at the kind of actual experience the student has in the magnet school to understand whether the expected treatment relates to the outcomes of interest. And some of this research has also looked at and found some benefits when you compare to kids who applied but didn't get a placement in a magnet school. So that tries to control for some of the methodological issues around, well, not every family is going to know about a school of choice. So those might be more motivated parents, more engaged, which then might naturally make those kids more likely to have higher achievement, for example. And so there are some types of ways in which someone ironically denying these kids the treatment that they want, going to a school of choice, at least helps us from a research perspective, being able to disentangle what exactly the benefit of these different choices may be.
Erica, you mentioned accountability, especially as it relates to like charter school closure. One of our audience members also asked how that compares to accountability for government funded school, or I guess government schools that are not doing very well or failing in some of their performance. So I don't know if either of you can maybe speak to like how, I know that states have handled this very differently as well. I live in North Carolina and I think we like report card for public schools. So I know that test scores is something that it's putting a lot of pressures on both school leaders and teachers. How do we make sense out of all of this in terms of like accountability in the different settings?
I can speak to a little of this and then I'm sure Kevin can add on. When I, about a decade ago, was really engaged in a lot of research looking across the country and looking at the differences between charter school legislation. And there was, I think, some real frustration by people in the charter school sector that the challenges sometimes of shutting down schools that weren't either kids weren't performing well. There were some real financial concerns that typically where charter schools got shut down, and at the time there weren't a lot being shut down. They were mainly for just these really egregious financial reasons. And of course that matters, just as anyone using money that's going to pay for children's education. I'll say as a parent, they should absolutely be held accountable, right? But I think there are other ways too of sort of thinking about this broadly. So some of my work has looked at whether charter schools are also being evaluated on how they meet what they set out in their charter in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. And so I think there has been a lot of questioning within the last decade to what extent to keep, to maybe reduce the variability and the sort of outcomes that Kevin was talking about. Can we think about ways as even a sector and making sure that we are living up to the flexibility, but also accountability, and making sure that we have sort of more fidelity to this notion of charter schools as being good options and trying to attend to sort of the lower tail, I guess, in the variation.
So yeah, I mean, it does get back to that issue of deregulation. When we deregulate, we free up good actors to do innovative good things, and we free up bad actors to do sorts of things, the financial mismanagement that Erica was talking about, or self-enrichment, fraud. I mean, there are all sorts of problems that we see in these sectors that have always existed to some extent in other sectors, in the traditional public school sector also. But the reason why we have bureaucracies in public schools is to address that, right? To try to tamp down the potential for either incompetent or bad people to do incompetent or bad things, right? And so there is this tension that we have both, and there's also a tension in the same deregulatory way around things like curriculum, right? So maybe it's helpful to think overseas a little bit. So think about in Western Europe, where a lot of the countries have systems that we might call voucher systems, but the private schools are operating essentially within a public bureaucracy, right? So issues of hiring, issues of curriculum, these sorts of things are standardized across the system, even though there are private schools that are being funded. Those are the trade-offs. We talk about the strings that follow public money. We don't want our tax money to be spent in ways that we don't approve of or that are stealing or fraudulent. And so we try to control that, usually through a bureaucracy, but oftentimes through other ways. When you speak to, when we speak to our friends in the school choice community, they oftentimes will think about accountability through market mechanisms, right? So that's the response. So we don't need a bureaucracy. We have parents who are making informed choices, and the bad schools will be identified or closed because of those market mechanisms. And that does to some extent happen. It clearly doesn't happen to the extent that any of us would like. And there are all sorts of reasons. Obviously, there are lots of really interesting studies in our field about how and why parents make choices. And it's not very comforting from that perspective when we understand the way that choices are made. It's not, the market accountability isn't really isn't playing out in the way we'd like to see. So there is this tension that policymakers have to face. Are they comfortable with a system that has bad actors essentially getting away with it quite a bit? Or do they want to bring in a more bureaucratic system or more bureaucratic controls that help to address that, but also might rein in some of the innovation available to the good actors? It's a real tension that we face when we get into this area.
So one thing that we discussed in planning that we opted to not explicitly mention in the intro was this notion of beacon and innovation schools. I don't want to digress too much or create too much of a tangent here, but can we quickly mention to the audience here in terms of how that model is intended to provide a little bit more flexibility within the public school system? How does that relate in terms of some of these accountability requirements to public bureaucracy?
So I think very briefly, a beacon or an innovation school looks a lot like the district-controlled charter school that Erica described. So the idea of freeing up a school from a lot of controls that are imposed by the state or by a collective bargaining agreement that we see with charter schools would also be the case with beacon or innovation schools. And it's just different states use different terminology. But the idea is that those elements of charter schools are carried over to that type of choice system. But instead of having the school be privately managed, privately operated, it would be operated within the school district.
Thank
And
you
so
so much.
Taylor, I would also just add, there's even sort of the most bureaucratized form of this, which is choice within a public school district or between public school districts. And so that, again, is trying to get at the notion we want parents to be making decisions about what school matches best for their own family and their desires, but isn't necessarily going as far on the deregulation front to say it doesn't need to be within the public sphere. So there's sort of this wide continuum around the sort of extent to which deregulation is part of the choice.
So we've talked a lot about different kind of accountability structures across the 3 different types of school choice and across states. And we've talked a little bit about the differences in research or the differences in outcomes that the research shows us. I'm curious if you two could both touch on the issue of equity in education. So there was a question earlier about using public tax dollars for private schools and what accountability looks like in that sphere. So I would just love if you could give some kind of background from, again, research you've done or research you've read about what we've learned about program successes in improving equity, and maybe talk about how school choice can be used as a tool to improve educational inequity. And then also on the flip side of that, what are some examples where we've seen that maybe school choice exacerbated inequity?
I guess I'll start. I think certainly going back to your initial introduction, Lorraine, magnet schools really began as a way to try to meet the goal of greater racial equity, and now actually increasingly socioeconomic equity, in allowing all kids the opportunity to these opportunity-rich schools, while still giving parents choice versus requiring them to do that. And so that, to me, though it is not implemented with fidelity everywhere, is still a sort of a classic example of using school choice for equity. And I think what I would point to there is the careful design of policy to try to counteract the ways in which school choice can naturally be stratifying. So there's a really intentional way of sharing information about the different school options that exist for families, in a way that you don't have to do when you're just matriculating to the neighborhood school. You have to actively apply for it. You have to know that you apply for it. You have to know the deadline. You have to know why it's worth potentially going further, that you can have transportation to it. So there are all these different information pieces that typically are not evenly provided to all families in a school district or that would be eligible. And also maybe stratified along social information, social networks, which are themselves highly segregated and stratified. And so that's why some of these really intentional design pieces can help to bring about more equitable outcomes. I think on the flip side, we see sometimes when there are not those intentional reasons or built-in mechanisms to try to counteract the way in which the fact that we live in a stratified society with stratified social networks, and the information provision is different, we can see different outcomes. And so some of the research I did, for example, in Pennsylvania with the charter school sector found that in metropolitan areas, even when families who were leaving the traditional public schools, when they were leaving already segregated public schools, they were making choices to go to charter schools that were more segregative. So Black students were choosing charter schools that were more segregated, the same for white parents, for example. And this is even when they had more diverse options within sort of their choice set, so within a mile or two. So I think there really needs to be this piece around how do we make sure, if the premise of school choice is to provide opportunity, making sure that everyone knows about the opportunity. It's not just available to those who have the right friends or have the ability to access it.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, I mean, my thinking, what I was thinking in response to the question is very similar. I mean, we know that school choice has the potential to do something very equitable, which is to break that link between housing segregation and school segregation, to provide opportunities to people to attend schools that they wouldn't otherwise have based on the traditional catchment area approach. But we also know that a deregulated system that just depends on sort of the magic of choice doesn't get us there. In fact, it actually adds a layer of segregation on top of the housing segregation, which is really tragic. So let me take a step back. School choice programs are oftentimes actually called parental choice programs, and they allocate educational opportunities to children based on the decisions made by parents or guardians. And there are really two basic truths there that we have to confront. The first is that those opportunities themselves are stratified, right? Within every given choice system that I've seen, there are better schools and worse schools. And the variation actually tends to be pretty stark. And then second, some parents are much more efficacious in working within those systems. Here we're getting to the things that Erica was talking about, right? Understanding the systems, learning about the options, figuring out the transportation, maneuvering through application forms, et cetera. And those efficacious parents are not randomly distributed, right? They're more likely, for example, to be professionals who have a more formal education, to have more time and money to do the research and provide the transportation. They're more likely to have English fluency. Right, so you all know the drill, and it's a rich get richer, poor get poorer dynamic, with a stark racial overlay. So those same children who are more likely to have a parent who can provide the rich opportunities to learn outside of school are also more likely to have parents who will access the best opportunities within a school choice system. Yeah, so that gets to the same conclusion that Erica was reaching, which is that designing a school choice system has to be very deliberate and take into account those realities.
I can provide myself as an example if it's helpful. I have a 2-year-old. Well, actually, she just turned 3. Sorry, I'm not in this world of K-12 yet, but I just got her into a pretty good preschool program. And if I had to drive her a little ways, I probably could. I didn't really want to, but I've talked to my neighbors about what kind of schools are you in? Do you like the elementary school here, or do you drive them somewhere else? And so the social information that I have at my disposal is very different than people in other social networks, right? But if I had to drive her to a better school, I would. But obviously, I am that person you're saying is like the middle income, higher education demographic that's really motivated to give my child like the best education possible. I just wanted to kind of illustrate maybe with a story. I don't know.
And Taylor, I would actually just take that example even further, right? So my kids are now in elementary school, but when I was pregnant with my first, 13 weeks pregnant, and people told me get on the waiting list for this preschool, right?
Yeah.
Which made me start crying because I was like, oh my gosh, this is too soon. Because it was a first come, first serve. If that preschool, which was excellent, had a lottery, that would have been one way of helping to mitigate my advantage as someone who had really well-connected friends. It probably would have also made some of us well-connected parents and angry because our advantage was being mitigated. So there's a trade-off, right? But there are things that could be done while also realizing those sort of stratification information networks will always exist.
That makes sense. I wondered if we might take a couple questions from the audience, if that's okay. One person asked about if there's ways that teachers can put their applications out in other states. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with any of those or not. If not, we can just say, I don't know. Sounds like Indeed for teachers. Another person asked about variation between charter schools, public charters, and what's district controlled, asking, is there a public database that helps to identify which schools are which? it seems like some show up on NCES as charter agency, but not sure if they have different categories or different types of charter schools. I mean, again, like I also was like, I Googled where's my school choice programs, but I wasn't sure if that was complete information because the list for Gaston County and North Carolina was actually kind of short. I was like, I don't know, where do I go for information? I ask a neighbor. So where do we find the information, and how do I don't know if anybody has any ideas about either question.
I can jump in here briefly just to say, this is a challenging thing to figure out. So there's both at the district level and NCES Common Core, which has information on all public schools, not the private schools. There's both an agency variable, which I think is the one you're talking about there. It's an independent charter school agency. So this is as it is in most states, it's a separate agency from the local school district. It would come up there. There's also a charter school flag that would help you see if there are charter schools within a district. So for example, I was looking at a district in Illinois yesterday, and there are two directly chartered schools that are part of the district schools. And so that's at least a way to identify what the charter schools are. Now, and I also heard in that question, though, how can I tell what's what? And that's where, I've really dug into some of the legislation to try to figure out what is the difference between states, and actually sometimes within states, in terms of the different types of charter schools. So like Louisiana has different ways in which you can charter schools. Most states have sort of an appeals process if your charter is denied. So I think really looking into the legislation is the way to get at some of the nuance about differences that really matter for who chooses schools and things like that.
I think this question is a good segue. Is how can we increase information to lessen the social network gap between families who may have different access to information? I don't know. I was even kind of wondering, like, how do we support sort of the social diffusion of information through like social marketing? I don't know if anything like that's ever been tried.
Yeah, so the book that you mentioned, the School's Choice book that I put out recently with one of our doctoral students here, we were looking at issues of charter school access and things that charter schools and authorizers and governments can do to increase access, and have done to increase access, as well as practices that schools are engaged in that limit access. And I think there are two things embedded. I'm going to expand the question a bit, because I think that the inequities that I was describing, the rich get richer, poor get poorer problem, it's caused by two things. One is by the stratification, right? The very real differences between the schools, and the other is by, well, I'll call the stratification at the there's the supply side stratification and demand side stratification, right? So there's stratification in terms of the parents' or guardians' ability to work the system. So one thing that was done on the supply side stratification, that we thought was interesting, it's used in DC and some other places in their charter school system, is what they call the secret shopper program. And so one of the issues that we found repeatedly was that a lot of access issues hit families with students with special needs. There are a lot of charter schools that don't provide the services and aren't very welcoming for students with particularly special needs that are a little more severe. As charters are within the public school system, there are some legal issues there with charter schools not serving those students. So what DC does is it actually has people call up these schools and try to enroll students who they describe as having special needs. And if the schools are discouraging them, then the district steps in and says, you need to change your policies, you need to change your practices. So I think a little bit of sort of monitoring on the part of authorizers and districts and states to make sure that our taxpayer money is going to accessible schools is part of it. But the specific question was more about the parental side. There are obvious things that can be done. So languages, right? So make sure the information is available in the languages within the community. There are some transportation issues that are addressed in some places. Erica mentioned a little bit of that. There are and this is more charters than vouchers, but there are districts that have set up essentially universal application processes so that a parent doesn't have to apply separately to every charter school. And there are some enforcement elements there also about what charter schools can ask in terms of special needs prior to application, in terms of immigration status, in terms of a variety of other things that have discouraged some families. But my friends in the charter school sector have been struggling with this for a long time, and there is no easy answer, right? So there are a lot of people working in that sector who are trying to address that exact issue. They don't want the system to be so stratifying. But the reality is we have a stratified society, right? And charter schools can't be somehow bounded from those inequalities. They have to address the realities.
And just to add in one other lesson we can take away from magnet schools and other school choice for integration is that by having sort of an overarching central body to try to provide information to all families. So having a postcard that goes out to all families with young children about all the options, district schools, charter schools, et cetera, that often is hard to happen because of the competition and frustration over like tax dollars and perceived sort of zero-sum game here. But in places where I've seen this work well, when there is some sort of centralized sharing of knowledge, so it goes out to everyone. There was one place in Louisiana in which kindergarten students had to know about the charter school and the traditional public school because they were pulling disparate groups of students. So I think also just lowering the barriers to submit applications, having it as short as you can, having it be able to be done on paper as well as through a cell phone. There have been a lot of strategies actually that people who are trying to use school choice to overcome inequity have really sort of tried to figure out best practices in this area. And certainly there's still more to be done. But I also think there is, if we could try to learn from the successes in different places, we could try to get at some of these gaps that exist.
I have a question that also came from our previous discussion. Is one of the things that is also kind of challenging is that the criteria of getting into some of these programs is often sort of creaming the crop of test scores. And that may actually be sort of a hindrance in not just like the ability of certain students to attend these schools, but also the ability of us to get information and understand how they're working. I didn't know if you wanted to speak at all to that in terms of like how some policymakers might approach that problem in terms of creating different standards of how students are selected or what criteria programs should be using to create more equal access.
I can think of two examples that I would just quickly note. One is federal legislation for magnet schools has an incentive for schools that don't have any kind of admissions requirement to try to make sure there aren't these extra things, which makes it then easier for us to compare how our magnet schools and their experience is different from students who are at these non-magnet schools. So, you know, there certainly is a way that legislation or financial programs can incentivize reducing these barriers or eliminating them, which is really important from a research perspective, so that we're not just, if an art school requires an audition, and then of course they always win the, you know, orchestral competitions, well, that's not surprising if they take the best to start with. And so sometimes I tell school leaders, you know, just trust your educators that they're going to do a great job with whoever you bring into the school. So that's sort of one piece of it. The second is that, certainly, and Kevin may speak more to this, some charter schools, for example, have had like these work requirements or things like that. Again, it's not an admissions like requirement per se, like not having a discipline record or things like that. But that does have a barrier for who can really make that choice or who can choose to stay in the school, because there's also concerns about attrition, particularly among some more disadvantaged groups from schools of choice as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important when we're talking about reforms that are essentially market reforms to understand that the basic premise is that people respond to incentives, right? And I think it's true. People respond to incentives. So lawmakers really need to be careful about what incentives are being put in place, right? I mean, it's sort of an obvious thing, but it doesn't seem to always be followed through on at the very least. So think about how incentives shape all sorts of behavior. They shape which students to pursue for enrollment, which students to discourage or otherwise avoid for enrollment, where to locate, how to spend money, what and how to teach, who to hire, where to advertise, how to advertise. The hiring is like, what are we looking for in terms of qualification and experience of teachers? Whether to enroll transient students mid-year is a really big one, whether to push out problematic students mid-year, and so much more, right? All that, the rules matter, the incentives matter, and when we look across states at these systems, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of deliberate thought put into how those incentives are put in place. And so a lot of the people working within school choice systems are just responding to the incentives that the system has. And they aren't, good or bad people in that respect. They're just responding to the incentives.
Well, I'm mindful of time. I know we only have a couple more minutes, so if attendees do have other questions, feel free to post them and we'll try to answer them by typing in the last few minutes here. But I'd love to just ask our panelists for just a concluding thought about, since we have this unique opportunity to talk to legislators directly, what do you see as the future of school choice from a legislation standpoint? And based on your research background, what would be, I know it's impossible to say your biggest piece of advice or your biggest idea, but what's one thing that you would offer to legislators who might be drafting legislation or voting on legislation in the school choice space?
Sort of hoping Erica would jump in. Oh, there you go, Eric. Go ahead.
So I have two, Lorraine. I guess one, we know that school choice is here to stay. Thinking about ways to create incentives so that it's school choice is more equitable and not in competition with traditional public schools, I think would really make a lot of what we've been talking about easier. I think the lack of information sharing, things like that, are related to some of this. So thinking about, and I think it can be done in terms of these details around policy design. The second is, we know that there's residential choice all the time, right? This is a way to try to provide non-residential choice. And I think if we can think about ways too of even merging residential and school choice in ways that could provide more equity, could also help to, reduce the need for transportation, for example, things like that. So really thinking about how this might pertain to other metropolitan policies could be something helpful to do.
I don't know, do I have time to respond to this question? So I will try to really quickly. I've been writing a lot recently about the potential implications of a line of Supreme Court cases, the most recent of which is the Carson v. Macon case out of Maine. And my argument, and I'm not the only one making this argument, is that we seem to be creating a situation with these cases where charter schools, or charter school policies, charter school laws are going to be legally forced to essentially become voucher laws, where the charters are going to be necessarily provided to churches and other religious institutions, and that the charter school operators, the religious charter school operators, are going to be provided with free exercise protection to essentially run them as religious schools. So that's one thing. And the other related issue is in those charter school voucher systems and in traditional voucher systems, there are going to be some interesting questions coming down the line about the capacity, the legal capacity of states to address things like discrimination, again, because of free exercise concerns. So I'm putting those out as anyone's welcome to contact me to find out more about what I'm thinking here. But these are, I think, things that are coming down the line.
Thank you so much. And I think I speak for all three of us. And if any legislators on this Zoom do have follow-up questions, definitely feel encouraged to reach out to us. And I know Taylor will probably share some other ways to get in touch with research to policy collaboration. So Taylor, I will hand it over to you to wrap up.
I just wanted to thank everyone for being here. I see we have still some dedicated attendees on our couple minutes over. So thank you so much for your time today. If there's any way we can be a resource to you in connecting policymakers with researchers and making those connections, please let us know. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.